Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thank you very much indeed for joining us today. I'm Helen Kennedy. I am the director of the ESRC Digital Good Network, which is hosting this talk today. On the Digital Good Network, we do visual self-descriptions to help people that need such things to create a visual picture of who is speaking. So I am a white woman in my 50s wearing glasses with shoulder length hair, and always the most important thing about my appearance is my sea life necklace collection, and today I'm wearing a black octopus. So welcome to this seminar on generative AI and the digital good, representation, bias and applications to misinformation. I'm delighted to welcome our colleague on the Digital Good Network, Dr. Scott Hale from the Oxford Internet Institute and the Alan Turing Institute, who's going to be talking for, I think, 35 minutes or so on this topic. And we're hosting this seminar in a way to kind of promote the use of computational methods and computational approaches to asking kind of societal questions. So on the Digital Good Network, our overarching question is, what does a good digital society look like and how do we get there? Just to remind you that we are recording this session so that it can be shared in video format after. It will be online, we hope, on Monday. You can ask questions in the Q&A function. Scott invites you to ask any clarification questions as we go along. He doesn't want you to be like holding on to a clarification question and then not totally following the rest of the things he says. So if you put those clarification questions in the Q&A, one of our colleagues, Ruth Launer, our network manager, will flag that to Scott, and he's happy to stop and address that question before he proceeds. So I think that's everything for me. I'm going to go camera off and mic off and hand over to Scott. Over to you, Scott.
Thank you so much, Helen, and welcome. It's great to see everyone. Well, maybe not see, but I see numbers going up as more and more people trickle in here, and it's great to have all of you joining this morning. I'm Scott. I'm the Emerging Methods Coordinator for the Digital Good Network. And overall, we're trying to bring people together across disciplines, across sectors, to really start to think about what do we want out of our digital technologies. Just in terms of visual descriptions for those who are listening or unable to see, I'm Scott. I'm middle-aged Asian man. You won't know that I'm about 2 meters tall, 6'4", and yeah, a little sleep deprived, having a very young child in the household who was up every hour or so last night. But you'll bear with me, and we'll have a great time this morning. I want to talk about 3 studies today, and also cover some of the funding opportunities and ways you can get involved in the Digital Good Network. So I'm going to talk about work that I'm doing on identifying misinformation narratives with large language models, things like OpenAI's, ChatGPT or GPT-4, Llama 2, etc. Talk about the ways that these models can be stereotypical, particularly in non-Western contexts. And finally, what can we do about it? How can we start to build more inclusive large language models? And I'll end with some of those funding opportunities here, but they're briefly there. And I should have put the website on this slide, but our PR team will forgive me, digitalgood.net. And all the details of those schemes are also out on the website. And, the big message I want to say throughout this is we need more people involved. We need diverse people involved to really help us understand and help society understand what do we want out of our online technologies, our digital technologies. As said, feel free to interrupt me throughout the presentation and just ask questions using the Q&A. So, more than 100 billion messages are exchanged every day on WhatsApp, which is just one of several communication platforms. In contrast, in all of human history, there are less than 250,000 fact checks to date. Well, of course, the vast majority of messages are not misinformation. The hard part is identifying the most important pernicious misinformation affecting a community, and that becomes harder as the volume of content grows unless we can use technology to help assist. That problem of scale is in part due to the current approach that fact-checking takes. Fact checkers in general examine claims one at a time in a sort of reactive, never-ending game of whack-a-mole. We've been working with the Annenberg Public Policy Center at the University of Pennsylvania, and they've pioneered an alternative approach. And this recognizes that the most dangerous, pernicious misinformation is not random. It forms around common themes that we can anticipate. And we can write high quality explainers about these themes in advance. Things like, how do vaccines work? Or what are the origins of monkeypox? And when a new claim emerges with novel specific details, we don't have to wait to retrospectively check that. This claim, for instance, that the US government is allegedly deliberately spreading monkeypox, which was a claim we saw on Chinese language social media, we could immediately match that to an existing article, say on the origins of monkeypox. And this would allow us to scale fact-checking far better than the current approaches. So how do we discover what these narratives are? There's a whole separate probably talk and approach for that. But what I can say is that when we talk to community organizations, they can already identify some of these narratives. Talking to a Asian American Pacific Islander group in the US, they said, oh, that's easy. One of the first ones that came to mind was this narrative that gun control is communist, quote unquote. And it seems to be perhaps pushed by those aligned with the Chinese Communist Party to undermine any effort at gun control and say, oh, well, you know, if you ask them for examples, you can point to examples. All country, you know, they'll point to content online where people are saying, oh, democratic countries all have gun ownership. And if you, you know, support democracy, you must support gun ownership, etc. These sorts of things. If we wanted to be able to identify this sort of content online so that we could maybe, you know, provide additional context, help people see and sort of just get a better sense of what does this look like in terms of what's out there. Well, the traditional approach to this would be a pretty slow and labor-intensive process, right? This is your traditional machine learning approach. We take, you know, data and, you know, we sample some of it out. We hire annotators, give them instructions, produce some labeled data, and only then are we able to train a classifier. As you can see, that's slow. It also involves some cost, some time for annotators, and critically, when it comes to identifying harmful content online, there's also a risk to annotators of vicarious trauma or secondary trauma by being re-exposed and repeatedly exposed to this content. So can we do better? Well, certainly. With human annotation, there's already approaches in the literature known as active learning. Let's be really selective in what is the content that we ask annotators, humans to label, right? We can sort of query some of our data, label some of it, start to build a classifier, and then understand, hey, where's our classifier uncertain? What's the type of data it hasn't seen? Let's go query more data, annotate a little more, right? And if we do this, we can reduce the amount of content and increase the speed with which we can annotate. One of the objects or one of the challenges, opportunities that my organization, my research team has been working with has been to say, well, could we replace or at least further decrease the involvement of human annotators by using large language models? So if we can go back and we can have a description in an example, something like that example that I shared of quote unquote gun control is communist and etc. We can give a few examples. Can we then ask a large language model to give us what are the keywords that we should be searching for in a vast, quantity of social media? All right, once we have those, we can go and query that social media, and then we can start to annotate it. And maybe rather than initially asking humans, we can ask a large language model. We can give it instructions, we can give it pieces of content, and it will produce the initial labeled data set. And that can help us train a local classifier that then we can scale up and use to label much larger data sets quickly and lower cost. Of course, the big question is, how do we keep this annotator, this LLM, sort of going the right direction? And so how can we have the human annotators involved here in sort of providing that supervision for the large language model? And so that's the sort of question that we've been working on with SIDNI. SINDI is Synthetic Dynamic Dataset Generation Framework for Misinformation Tasks. And so given a topic, we go and query social media, construct queries, and essentially create this large social media data set. And where we're at currently is that using a large language model, we're able to label that data set in terms of topic, the claims that are within it, and how those claims relate to one another. And this gives us a annotated or pseudo-annotated data set with those things. So a post and the claims that are in it, a post and the topics that are in it, and then the relationship between two claims. Do two claims support one another, or does one undermine the other? And so we looked at these three tasks. We trained models, T5 models, just specifically on claim matching, on topic, and on claim relationships, and compared what happened when we trained on the labels from a large language model compared to when we trained purely on human labels. And so in terms of claim matching, we saw that it was about the same between the two. When it came to topic, the next two, one data set, we saw a bit of a drop off. The other data set, we actually saw a bit of an improvement by using the LLM labels. And for the final one on sort of the relationship between claims, again, the LLM labels were slightly behind the human labels. But even so, right, we got these LLM labels very quickly and without any risks to human annotators as well. So I'll pause, see what people are sharing here as well. Agile governance. We'll come back to some of these maybe as well in the questions, but good questions. Keep them coming. Where we're at in terms of this particular work is needing more development and testing. We don't yet have that relationship between where do human annotators come into the process with large language models. We want to start seeing if we can get feedback from people who would actually be using this technology. So I also, in addition to my role at Oxford, work with a nonprofit organization, Midan, that builds tools for fact checkers. And so this is pretty close to what the current interface looks like when fact checkers are collecting content that they might want to fact check, they want to evaluate it. But this is a mock-up that added one additional column where we have a sort of narrative theme or narrative category. And we think that the work I've just shown, that work from Cindy, which is, was led by the University of Connecticut with Midan, could be the solution, or could be the first approach at least, to help us get these sorts of larger categories onto content. The other challenge, though, is that right now, Cindy is working in English. We haven't tried it to work in other languages, and we don't know how it might vary across different cultural contexts. And certainly, one aspect of what we look at in the digital good and think about as one of our core pillars is inclusivity. How can we ensure that technology sort of works for everyone and not just for certain groups? And so that brings me to the next question, or the next study, where one of my master's students at Oxford, Kyati, led a study looking at stereotypical responses in large language models and how those varied across context. There is a little bit of a content warning. I'm pulling examples from this paper, which has some stereotypical language. Obviously, none of the authors endorse any of those. Same, none of us endorse any of the false narratives or content I've shown previously as well, but I want to give that content warning there. So maybe it's just as taking one step back to start. Machine learning classifiers reflect biases in their training data. There's no surprise there. I'm showing a figure from a 2018 paper that I wasn't involved in, but it shows the relationship between how words are represented in a vector space created by a machine learning classifier. So sort of internally, how is a machine learning algorithm sort of representing different words? It's showing that relationship or those representations and how they relate to the percent of women that are involved in different occupations. And so each one of these dots is an occupation. The authors trained what are known as word embeddings back in 2018. And we can see that there's a clear correlation here. And the words that the occupations that have historically been more associated with men are over here. And those associated with women are there. There's clear differences in the representations. But even beyond the actual relationship, there are some clear outliers as well. Now, whether this is good or bad depends a little bit on your task, right? If my goal was simply to analyze historical data and understand what a data set was showing, I wouldn't want to necessarily make any corrections or changes to what the machine learning classifier is learning from the data. On the other hand, when we think about building generative AI technology, it seems problematic, to me at least, if young women or girls are going to ask about engineering or mechanic professions, and if the text that they get from a large language model or the images that they get from an image model overwhelmingly show only men in those occupations, because that's sort of a disconnect with, I think, at least my ideal of, and I think many of our ideals of, wanting anyone to feel that they could participate in any occupation. So the way that large language models generally try to avoid this is they ask people to look at different outputs and rate those outputs. And over time, by examining this human feedback, so this is known as reinforcement learning with human feedback, RLHF. Fancy names. But the idea is that by looking at that output, we can tweak the behavior of these generative models and teach them to maybe, say, generate content that is less biased. So we wanted to look at different examples of bias that might exist in large language models. And so we looked for this sort of stereotypical language. And so here is an example of two phrases, which one you might say is stereotypical in the Indian context, and one that is anti-stereotypical in an Indian context. And our thought was we wanted to look both across the sort of US-centric view. So let's look at gender, let's look at race, and ask for test stereotypical outputs, see which ones a large language model was more likely to produce. And then let's look at caste and religion from an Indian context. And so that's our sort of setup. We have caste, religion, I guess I'm not showing the Western ones. We took those from previous literature, and then we created these based on literature, based on interviews and talking with experts, as well as in India, to sort of create attributes that we thought were stereotypically associated, and then test the LLM in these setups. So how do we actually measure whether or not there's bias there? This slide is a bit technical. At the end of the day, these all come down to a sort of percentage, if you like. You can interpret it from a 0 to 1, from 0 being very unlikely to 1 being very likely. For those who want the technical details, for those where we could actually, open source model, we can look at it. We could go and look at this sort of all unmasked likelihood score. Go look at every token, average it, and get an overall score for how likely is a stereotypical sentence over an anti-stereotypical one. For decoder models, we could look at a similar property known as a conditional log likelihood. And this is simply looking at the probability of that stereotypical word following the input sentence. Finally, for models that are closed, things like OpenAI's model, we can't actually inspect what's happening inside the model. So all we can do is we ask the model to sort of complete the sentence. We ask it a number of times, different temperatures, different parameters, and we look how often does it give us one of the words that was in our stereotypical list, basically. All right, so these are the results for our encoder LLMs. These are smaller models, I guess, at this point that you could actually run locally. We can get a better sense of how they're doing. And keep in mind, so it would be about 50% if the model were just choosing either category equally, right? So if it's gender and it's sort of men or women equally associated with an adjective, we'd expect it to be about 50. And indeed, yep.
Sorry to interrupt you, but there's a question from the audience that seems like a bit of a clarifying question.
Please, yeah.
I would draw your attention to it. Amy's saying they're a bit confused about the study bias in LLMs. If biases are contextualized in cultures and environments, how can you quantify the biases?
Yeah. So the question here, I guess, is to try to compare, and what this slide and the next will show is what we're really interested in, I guess, is how does the behavior of the large language model differ when we're looking at categories that are more associated, say, with India, versus those that are more associated with the West or the US. And the big takeaway here is you'll see that, for the US categories, for these three models, we're pretty close to 50%, i.e. there isn't a really strong association between, say, gender and these various adjectives we were looking at, or race. But when we move to the Indian context, there is more of an association and more of a tendency towards those stereotypical words. Now, obviously, yeah, it's complex, and maybe not every example we've chosen, people might disagree about whether those are stereotypical or not, I suppose. There's a bigger social science question there, absolutely. I guess we've tried to choose the ones that Indian academics and thought leaders agreed on, for the most part, as being more stereotypical. And the US ones, again, were taken from prior literature that had done similar. When we look at the well, let's see, mostly open source, aside from GPT 3.5 over here, so the much larger, newer models, we again see generally numbers close to 50% for the US categories, but often higher for India, particularly CAST, although not always. Here, Llama 2 has is closer to 50%. Interesting, Llama 2 actually is, when it comes to the US categories, really prefers anti-stereotypical outputs, right? And so, for example, it would much rather say, I don't know, gender, it would much rather say the doctor is a woman than to produce the sentence, the doctor is a man, for instance. But, quite the opposite well, at least somewhat the opposite when it comes to caste and religion. And so I'll share one further thought here, which is, well, what can we possibly do about this? One thing we tried was we simply asked GPT 3.5 to, in addition to completing the sentence, we asked it to remember not to have any so-and-so biases, not to have any caste-based biases, don't have any religious biases while responding, etc. And we found that without that prompt, again, here we had more stereotypical behavior. Once we reminded the model, we actually had less stereotypical behavior. This isn't, perfect. There's certainly lots more we have to learn. And in particular, one question is, where is this coming from, right? And part of our hypothesis, right, is that when we recruit individuals to give feedback to large language models, we did a review of that, of the studies that share those demographics. Most of the time, they're not shared. And when they are, they often tend to be small groups of individuals giving feedback to train those large language models, and they tend to be mostly based in the US. And so we think that one of the reasons we see more bias in examples that pertain to the Indian context is simply because the models haven't been given feedback from those contexts. And so that leads me to the final study that I want to talk about, led by Hannah Kirk, a DPhil student in my group at the Oxford Internet Institute, and that's the Griffin alignment project. If so much, the existing models are trained with small groups of annotators, mostly American, we wanted to ask, well, what would it look like if we actually went and asked a really diverse group of people across the world to rate different LLMs? And so that's what we've created with Griffin. It's a new data set where we're asking people both what they think about LLMs, how much they've interacted, what they know about LLMs, more of a traditional survey. And then we're having them actually go and have conversations with LLMs, somewhere between 6 to 9 conversations. And they ask a question, they get 4 different outputs from 4 different LLMs, and they rate those outputs. They can continue the conversation, and then they give us feedback on their overall interaction. And we can compare both, what people think about LLMs, how they say they want LLMs to behave in the abstract, and then how do they actually respond when they're really involved in a specific conversation with an LLM, and how do they rate those specific conversations on similar dimensions? So Griffin is this acronym for granular, representative, inclusive feedback for individualized feedback for inclusive alignment. So I'll talk just briefly about each of those, and to say we've now collected this data. We're in the process of analyzing it. I've refrained from putting any preliminary findings in because I think it's very nuanced, and I don't want to, share anything that might until we're absolutely certain of where the findings are. But I will share the data. I'll share the overview of the project, and I'll point you to the website where that QR code at the bottom, where we'll be releasing the data probably in another month or two. So granular, we have sliding scales rather than simply many tasks are, do you prefer output 1 or output 2? Instead, we're asking people to rate these all the way from each one from terrible to perfect. Here's the example of 4 different responses, then 4 different LLMs to a user's prompt, in this case to ask for a funny joke. We get fine-grained ratings as well as text explanations. And so after they've had that conversation, we ask how the model performed in response to different aspects, like whether or not the responses reflected their values or culture, whether it was well written, coherent, factual, informative, etc. And again, we'll get those responses both for how it performed and how important this aspect is to the individual responding. Second, representative. So we're using prolific, and we're able to get census representative, at least in terms of gender and age, both in the US and the UK. And beyond that, we're able to sort of open it up to respondents in other countries. And actually, that's an out-of-date number. We have about 75 countries now represented in the data. And yeah, and the one limitation there is it's still English. So that is something we hope we could change in the future. But we now have both a sort of breadth in terms of individuals across many different countries, as well as some depth in at least the UK and the US, where we have some of the demographic diversity. And we have actually over 25 models that are being randomly chosen on every time a user's asking a question. We choose 4 of those. And so we get a much wider selection of people's ratings across different models. It's individualized, so we have ratings tied to a user profile. This includes people telling us how they prefer LLMs to behave, and maybe writing a short self-description of almost a user constitution. If you're familiar with the Anthropic approach of constitutional AI, LLM should do this, should not do that, right? A sort of brief prompt for how someone wants an LLM to behave. And so we can compare maybe how, if we can adapt LLM behavior in the future by using some of those instructions from individuals as well. And as mentioned, we can track both what people say they want before they start these conversations, as well as what they actually rate as being important in each conversation. And yeah, the last part is inclusive alignment. And it's, I think, again, it goes back to one of those core pillars we have in the DGN and the Digital Good Network of inclusivity. And so we want to see more people involved in the development of large language models. We want to create data sets like this, understand how diversity can help and maybe adapt and change LLM behavior. So I'll point just to 2 other studies, which I'm not going to go into, but one of these is when we talk about alignment. Yes, I'm happy to share the slides. Thanks for asking. One is when we talk about alignment, what do we actually mean? There's so many studies that mention the word alignment, but actually don't really define it, or it's inconsistently defined across the literature. Even if we say we want alignment, what does that mean? And is it a sort of universal? Or back to the earlier question, given everything, bias and other elements are often contextualized, often relevant to a particular culture, context, place, time. Should we be thinking about personalizing models? Again, this is, I think, a really apt question for, people who want to think about the digital good. How much personalization should we have in models? And we put out a paper preprint at the moment for thinking about personalization within bounds. What are the opportunities to better personalize large language models? But maybe, where might there be limits? What are the things where there might be common baselines? Like we have common international agreements on some content or human rights, for instance, where we think models shouldn't go beyond, or shouldn't, you shouldn't be able to personalize a model to to maybe say overtly hate speech or terrorist content or something like that. So again, I'll leave you with those papers as a further area to explore. In the last few minutes I want to just set up some of the opportunities that we have in the Digital Good Network for everyone to get involved. And these are the funding opportunities. I'll also show the link to the newsletter at the end. Mostly, we just want to get people involved. If we're going to build a network to help us better understand what we want out of our digital technologies, we need more people involved. We need diverse people involved. And so the first one is this Digital Good Research Fund. We had a call last year, and we funded a number of projects. Those are coming to a conclusion, and we're opening up a new call specifically focused on evaluating the digital good. And I'm excited that I think we have some good, people represented here in terms of methods and measuring computational approaches. We're particularly excited about some of those, but we don't want things that are exclusive to one discipline. So we want to find teams that are interdisciplinary. We hope that teams will promote early career researcher leadership, and that they'll consider having communities or organizations external to research so that we have a sense of what we're evaluating, how that relates maybe to some more of the social science understandings of good, and also how it relates to how people might actually use technology in practice. This call is currently live. Projects will be 20,000 to 50,000 funded at 80% full economic cost. This is a UK thing for those outside of the UK. The deadline is the 25th of April. If you are outside of the UK, you can't lead one of these projects, but you can partner with a UK organization and can receive funding through this call as well. Again, digitalgood.net. You'll see that website on pretty much every slide. That's where all the details are. Fellowships, particularly if you are outside of the UK, and maybe you want to come to the UK and partner with one of the, or be hosted by one of the institutions where our management team members are based. This is an opportunity for funding to support that travel, the accommodation, visa costs, things of that nature, to be able to get you to the UK and working with teams. And we've ring-fenced half of the money here in this call will be going to people who are from the global south, quote unquote, the larger world, I'll call it, or where the proposed activities are taking place in or about the larger world. And so we also, again, welcome applications, both from academics, but also individuals from policy, industry, community, and civil society as well. Again, it's live. There's an expression of interest by the end of April, and the formal application on the 28th of June. There'll be a live webinar coming up in March. I'm not sure the specific date, but if you sign up for our mailing list, you'll know when the specific date comes. And the last one for any PhD students who are here, we're having a summer school. Again, this year, we had a great turnout, a great group of people coming together last year. Just, if you're in a department where you're maybe one of the few people thinking about digital good, et cetera, just getting together and meeting scholars who are in the same career stage, in maybe similar situation, but different departments, I have found to be incredibly valuable. And you form these sort of cohort bonds that, you stay in touch afterwards as well. So it will be the 24th to the 26th of June in Sheffield. There's a blog up there about last year's experience. And this one is, coming up very soon. So 15th of February, got to be a little quick, but it's not a difficult application. Again, Helen will correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I believe there's funding for individuals beyond PhD students beyond the UK as well. And so, yeah, hopefully, if you're a PhD student, please do jump in. Helen says, yes, it does include opportunities for people beyond the UK. So super excited about that. Again, here's the one page to take if you do a screen capture or get the chat. Ruth will drop in any of these links, but all the details are on this digitalgood.net website. any questions, you can reach out to info@digitalgood, and there's both a link on the website to the newsletter, or this QR code will take you to that subscribe page. It's not a busy, heavy traffic newsletter. It's, mostly just getting out some of these opportunities, letting you know about the events that are happening. And yeah, it'd be great to have people come. So just a few concluding thoughts. I don't know what the digital good is, but I do know that we have a lot of work to do, and we need diverse people at the table. We need to try out lots of different ideas, contribute lots of thoughts, get lots of perspectives. And so I'm super excited for everyone who's joined today. And I also want to say a big thank you to everyone who's been involved in the 3 different research studies that I talked about during this presentation as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Scott. That was amazing. Absolutely loads of food for thought, and, really exciting phrases like Monte Carlo simulation that maybe some of us have never heard of before, but, we're excited about. So we have about 15 minutes for Q&A. There is one question in the chat, which I'm going to read out, and then we can go over to the Q&A window for the remaining questions. So any more questions, put them in the Q&A and not in the chat. The one that's in the chat is from Freya, and it's one you'd spotted earlier on in your presentation, Scott. So the question is, can we use this to help develop anticipatory and agile governance of AI innovations, something like predictive policy making? Freya says, I'm working on this, but haven't found many ways where this has been put into practice. So I'm interested to hear from people who know how this works or would work in practice. Have you got any thoughts about that, Scott?
Yeah, thanks, Freya. I think this came up during the first presentation, talking about sort of identifying narrative topics and some of the ways we could maybe use LLMs to help engage in social listening. Now, I'm not an expert here on governance, nor sort of predictive policy making. I think there's probably a challenge in sort of how far to predict in the future. But in terms of the way that this has been walked back in a lot of computational social science is to say, well, before we can do prediction, can we do nowcasting? Can we better measure what's happening right now, knowing that a lot of our traditional indicators have a lag? Right. If you look at, Center for Disease Control, official stats on flu or something, they're going to come out months after the time period they're talking about. So can we at least look at what's happening right now? And I do think that some of the approaches that we're using in terms of large language models, querying, or creating the queries and querying open social media data, being able to label that data and pull out claims, topics, the relationships between these, might be an approach that helps at least give a sense of where the current conversations are, and might spot things that are happening, or conversations happening in one place that just haven't yet made it to the mainstream. And so maybe that's a small way that we get towards prediction is at least understanding what are those conversations that might break into the mainstream before they have.
Brilliant. Thank you, Scott. So going over to the Q&A, I'm going to pick out Jia Hong's question first, because I know that also popped up in the chat. So the question is there any empirical evidence comparing the accuracy of machine annotators and human annotators? And I guess there's a sort of broader question of the human taken as a proxy for accurate, right? Maybe the machine is more accurate, maybe accuracy isn't the right measure. So there's quite a lot to unpick there.
Yeah, I mean, I shared one of these slides that we had, right, which was showing when we trained a T5 model, either on human output, or we trained it on the machine learning generated labels, that the results, were similar. There were, in some instances, a drop-off between what we'd achieved on with human labels and what was happening on say the labels created by the LLMs. I think this gives you a sense that there's something there. There's certainly signal in the large language model labeled data. It, I think we could certainly dive deeper into exactly what are the differences and how accurate specifically are those labels. I think Helen makes a good point that we could also dive deeper and say how accurate are some of the human labels. I do think we have a lot to learn, specifically on how that might also, again, change across language, change across cultural contexts as well. What I'll say is that I think there are different challenges with different methods of annotation. Training up experts, a small group of human annotators to label data can be really effective. And we've done this with hate speech, where we really needed expert annotators to follow a rubric and being able to talk to them, have them go through training, for instance, and do labels. We were able, what we thought, still have very high quality labels. Of course, many times we've gone to the crowd, Amazon Mechanical Turk, Prolific, other crowdsourcing websites, and asked for content to be labeled. And one of the challenges you have there is simply people may be, moving between lots of different tasks. They may not, they may be more motivated by payment than accuracy, and so there's always a challenge of this, and that's why you usually have multiple people annotate and look for sort of consensus and agreement amongst different annotators with crowd labeled data. LLMs maybe don't have some of those same challenges. They're not going to lose attention, and they're not there for making money. At least the LLM itself isn't benefiting from cash. Maybe its creators are. But obviously they may lack certain understandings of current events, may lack certain cultural understandings. So again, I don't have the answer entirely. I think there's a lot that we should learn. I have seen some recent studies coming out in this area, and I think we'll know a lot more soon.
Brilliant, thank you, Scott. So I'm not an expert in the topic that you're talking about, but I think that there's a link between a couple of questions in here, so I'm going to kind of put them together. So Stefan asks, how do we best deal with the bias in the training of LLMs that results in, for example, caste-based biases in output? Will the new technology you're developing help identify useful ways of doing this? And I think Siwok's comment is related. I think the methods introduced in the talk are focused on how we can gear the models to mitigate bias after they've been trained. Are there any approaches to reduce bias during the training phase, potentially minimizing the human input? And I also wondered, with your Griffin project, is it going to feed into LLM behavior? So it's a sort of, the input stage of the LLM training. I think there's a cluster of questions around there.
Yeah, definitely. So I think all of these are related, and you're absolutely right. I didn't include a slide here, but I have a deck that sort of shows all the ways that human input touches, the training of an LLM. And certainly one of the big ones is the initial data that we're training on. An LLM is simply learning, relationships between words. Block out a word, what's its surrounding, or given a surrounding, what's the word, etc. Once you have that base model, you're then fine-tuning it to try to align in some sense to what behavior we want that LLM to have. And that's much closer to what I presented in Griffin, where you're asking individuals, hey, you've given us a prompt, or here is a prompt. Here are multiple outputs. Which of these is better and why? And then we train a reward model to sort of cover that space and try to update the initial trained model to reflect that, right? Then, of course, once the model's actually, that's the point where usually either a model's open sourced or put behind an API, and now people can start interacting with it. You have further ways you adjust that model by maybe giving it instructions at the time it's responding, and by collecting feedback from users as they interact with it. So Griffin, I think, does sit in that second stage of fine-tuning the model after it's been pre-trained. And the thought here is in terms of how do we get models to, say, avoid cast-based biases, is to have more example inputs and example outputs that cover a topic like cast at that fine-tuning stage, where the model can be instructed to essentially avoid at least persistently producing stereotypes, for instance. And so our hypothesis with the Griffin work is that by including more diversity, in terms of the annotators, we're going to get diversity in terms of what are they asking about, and diversity in in evaluating how models are responding to that. So again, I don't have the internal knowledge for exactly where all the challenges we've seen come from. But I think one of the reasons that we don't see as much stereotypical behavior in, say, gender or race as we do in caste in that study is because at the fine-tuning stage, I suspect there was a lot more data that dealt with race or gender than dealt with caste. And so I think one challenge here is that if we can enumerate, if we can, specify the bias, say it, we can probably produce outputs and to help train the model away from those types of biases. So one is if we can be aware of the bias, we can probably deal with it. And you might be more aware of more biases if you have more diverse people involved at that stage. To Seiwuk's question, yeah, you're right. Maybe in some instances, we need to back up the chain, right? And ask, well, where were these biases coming from in the first place? And it's often from that pre-training data. Excuse me. And so, yeah, maybe could we be more selective in the data? Data sets are often already sort of scrubbed maybe for spam or lower quality content before they go into the training process. There might be an opportunity there. Right now, I guess our current models have generally been limited on the compute power that was available. How big could we make the model based on how much compute was available? Very quickly, I believe we're approaching a situation where we might actually be data bound. We simply don't have enough data to increase performance of the models. They need an incredible amount of data to start learning these associations and improve. And so right now the thought has been, well, throw everything at them. And I do think we have to think about how might we get by with doing more with less data maybe, but more higher quality data. There's a challenge here because right now the sort of direction is we just need more data, get more and more of it. But I think Seiwuk's comment points towards this tension of more data isn't necessarily high quality data. And so there's certainly an opportunity here to think about that data. Obviously, to also think about lots of things that have been in the news in terms of representation in that data, licensing of data, how are content creators being compensated, all of that. How do we get to data sets that we say, oh, we do want models trained on these data sets, and it's going to both reflect the types of things that we want in models, and that the data is sort of with communities, maybe not just from extractive of communities.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Scott. Really fantastic and detailed answers. So we've got quite a few questions and only time for one more, I think. So I'm sorry about that, but maybe we can just make a note of the others and see if we can deal with them outside of the webinar. So can you give us a relatively quick response to this question from Amy, which is, given that AI is being advanced every single hour, how can we keep up with the examination? Isn't it too slow to manually examine the biases and stereotypes?
I was trying to find a preprint on that, but yeah, you're absolutely right. It's difficult to manually do this. One of the things we're thinking about is, can you create test suites. So this is a paper that specifically is along those lines. It's not going to cover everything. But again, if we can enumerate some of the biases, we might be able to have ways to test those quickly. So one idea is for LLMs to test other LLMs in their responses. For instance, this paper puts together a sort of test suite, tries out that idea, and is led by Bertie Vigin, a collaborator of mine. So that's one quick answer. Clearly, it's not the only solution, and it's not the answer by any means. But I think you're absolutely right to acknowledge that, or to identify that we need to figure out how we can scale up this sort of work.
Thank you, Scott. We will make a note of the remaining questions and see if we can find a way of answering them. But I think it's important to draw things to an end a minute or two before the hour, as some of us might be moving on immediately to an 11 o'clock engagement. So I think it's timely to wrap up now. It looks like in the chat there's a bit of a problem with subscribing to our newsletter at the moment. So if you want to email info@digitalgood.net, you can be added manually while we try to work out what that problem is. But once again, thank you so much for joining us today, and a huge thanks to Scott, who I think has really shown how we can engage these computational methods for thinking about this sort of intersection of what we don't want from our digital society and how we might start to move towards what we do want. So thanks very much, Scott, for a fascinating talk. And as always, thanks to our behind the scenes team, Ruth and Nikki, making everything work technically and in terms of responding to questions in the chat. So thanks, everyone, and goodbye for now.
Thank you very much.
Hello again. So I've been asked to maybe come back and give a few additional responses to questions that we weren't able to get to before we ran out of time in the webinar. So I'm going to just briefly cover those. Yeah, if you're listening later, still do have questions, do reach out. Always excited to sort of engage. So I'll start. I just wanted to actually share. This was the diagram I was talking about just a moment before in the Q&A that happened in the webinar. I went and dug it out of an old slide deck, just thinking about all the different ways that human input touches the LLM training, right? And so from the sort of pre-training to the reinforcement learning with human feedback, give people two outputs, say which one is better. And then you have this prompt engineering or system prompts. How do you actually instruct the LLM at the time? Bunch of trust and safety ongoing monitoring, at least for models that are behind an API. And similarly, you may get in the wild sort of feedback. I think that's helpful grounding, both for those previous questions, but also for three of the questions we didn't get to, which I'm going to group together. I think they all get to a fundamental question, which is to say, maybe we shouldn't be going after fixing just the LLMs, but as the questions say here, is there a danger that we're trying to debias LLMs offers a techno-solutionist fix rather than treating it as part of the wider social assemblages that they're embedded in? The second question that was from Sanjay. Freya also made a similar point. If we're going after the data, it's important, but we hardly hear people dealing and acknowledging that data is collected by society systems that are completely biased. So controversially, should we not spend as much time on improving society, better data, problem solved, smiley face. And I think the last one I'll take as well into this group, which is wondering whether a better understanding of disguised biases in LLMs can help us address biases, stereotypical approaches that are embedded in digital literacy schemes, which are designed for seemingly marginalized and broadly illiterate communities Thank you. I think that's a critique of those projects. I'm not an expert in digital literacy, so I won't be able to answer that specifically, but I do want to comment. In general, I think that's right. One of the slides I had earlier was showing this relationship between, say, the gender and occupation, and LLMs, like most machine learning, are trained on flawed data. Perhaps they're trained on past data, and so they're often, reflecting where we were, and there's a natural tendency, of course, for LLMs or any machine learning to be in the past. So I agree generally that yes, there isn't a techno-solutionist fix here. We should see society and technology in a dyadic relationship with one another. Society is influencing the data that LLMs are training on. They're reflecting some of that back. But I think we also have to appreciate that other link that as more and more people maybe adopt generative AI, or it gets embedded into other approaches, it may also influence where society goes. So I think it's right that we think about what might be some of the changes we can make to LLMs that maybe better reflect where we want to go as a society. At the same time, we should be certainly aware that that the biases present are there because they're in data that human societies have produced. I'll flag up one project that I think is interesting. I'm a co-I on this project, but it's led by the University of Connecticut and Professor Shiri Doriahan there, and it's BRIMI, Bias Reduction in Medical Information. It was responding to a fairness in AI call, which ostensibly the whole call was about how do you make AI systems fairer. And Shiri had this great insight that she could flip it essentially and ask, how can we use AI to help make society fairer? And it built on previous work that she and collaborators had done identifying biases in medical textbooks. And so building up machine learning systems to actually identify where there are biases in curricula, let's say in textbooks, in other content that we're just sort of passing on uncritically because these things have been assembled over years, and maybe we haven't, someone hasn't gone in a detailed level through to identify that. And I think this connects with that last question about, can you identify biases, stereotypes in, say, digital literacy schemes? I think in any sort of scheme that's out there, there's this opportunity both ways. LLMs will reflect society, but we might also be able to use machine learning LLMs to both influence where we want to go or identify some of the biases in content that are out there currently, and then maybe we can use that to help update and change laws or change documents. I'm reminded of sort of women's rights work and the way that I didn't prepare this. I don't have the right project. There was essentially a lawsuit where the federal government compiled all this huge list of all these gender-based laws that were on the books at the time. And that actually provided essentially the hit list for the ACLU to go and attack each of these laws in a lawsuit and find them unconstitutional. And so anyway, there's certainly much scope for improvement of society and for improvement of technology. And I think these questions are absolutely right, that we shouldn't be focusing only on technology. I also say I don't think we can focus only on society. We need to do both. They're involved in in a relationship where each is influencing the other. It's complex, and again, why we need more people involved in all of this. I had another unanswered question. This is from Sewuk on thoughts about. Oh no, sorry, this is a different one on Frasier. Again, on thoughts about the proposal to use synthetic data to make data sets less biased. Again, ethical issues here. Thanks for a lot for food for thought. I don't have a tremendously informed opinion on the use of synthetic data. I've used synthetic data in the past when we were, say, evaluating word embeddings, and it allowed us to really understand what aspects of language these word embeddings were capturing as we looked at, say, change in language over time, which was our use case a number of years back. I think there's a role for synthetic data. And again, I think there's a question about what is that data, how's it produced, what's it used for, and so there's probably not a blanket it's good or bad answer to this. I think it's complex, it's contextual, but I do think there's likely a role for synthetic data in terms of being able to at least measure and perhaps be able to reduce data set biases. Another question, this was the one from Sewuk, on whether or not open source AI would outperform closed source AI in reducing biases given its open source nature. I don't think that there's a direct relationship there yet. And certainly even the open source models that we're seeing are sort of produced by a small number of labs and organizations that have the compute, have the data, the ability to fund, what are very expensive models to create at this point. I think there's an open question there. One study that did come to mind reading this question was this one, branch, train, merge. They have this idea of expert language models, or ELM models, and the idea that you might be able to create a mix of many different models that work together and can ultimately outperform any one monolithic model. I think that's a really exciting model for a sort of open source ecosystem of generative AI. This idea that you could, essentially have different experts that are working together, and many groups could train these experts and put them together. And so you could end up with different groups specializing in different ways. I wasn't at all involved in this study, and I have no particular knowledge beyond the paper. But to me, this was just one paper that stuck out as something I'd read or become aware of recently, and sticks out as sort of, what would an open source ecosystem look like? How might you democratize and move away from monolithic models that only a small number of organizations could create, to something where you could actually have the benefits of open source because you reduce the cost of being able to contribute. And it's not just that more can contribute, but then you ultimately, ideally, are getting a better outcome from that. So those were the remaining questions that were there. I thank you again for coming, and if you're still listening to the recording, thanks for listening to the end. Super excited to take the conversation forward, and very thankful to everyone here. So thank you.